is more than just science, technology, engineering, and math, but as our friends in North Carolina like to say, strategies that engage minds. And we want to engage all the kids, and we think Design Challenge is a great way to do that. We also think, Noah, do you mind if I share my screen? We also think that it's a great way to experience all of the best practices in STEM. First being culture, right? Like we believe in helping schools facilitate a culture of entrepreneurship, innovation, helping students create strong STEM identities where they believe in their own abilities to participate in being an innovator and problem solver so that they have a strong sense of STEM efficacy, creating a culture where the adults at the school have a strong sense of STEM efficacy, that they know that I might be an ELA person. I am. Perhaps I don't consider myself a natural born STEMist, but I'm a natural born problem solver. And that's not something I knew about myself until just a couple of years ago. We also want to be able to create connections to, that culture, creating opportunities for teachers to plan together, doing things like engaging your business advisory council, making sure that that STEM mindset permeates throughout the entire school, and then it's supported by an authentic, relevant, rigorous curriculum where students have opportunities to engage in real world learning. We believe that the Design Challenge is that in a nutshell, right? And then the last thing, we always want to try to create opportunities for connections to create context for classroom learning. If you're only learning math from 9 a.m. to 9:45 every day, and you don't use those skills different times of the day, or see how adults in industry in the real world use those skills, then you're not going to have as much meaning opportunities for those things to stick. So we believe that creation of things like the Design Challenge will help us be able to confidently answer that question that kids tend to give, when am I ever going to use this stuff? Well, we can show them. We can show them when they're ever going to be able to use that stuff by exposing students to things outside of the classroom to help them understand through community experiences how people use what they're learning in school to make a difference, in their lives. So this here says designation requirements, but really this is just another way of saying these are the things, the keystones for high quality STEM education. And by participating in the Design Challenge, you're moving forward on this path. You're helping facilitate a culture of innovation. You're creating opportunities for inquiry-based learning that's hands-on, connected to the content standards, hopefully creating partnerships with community partners, giving an opportunity for teachers to develop one more step, one more skill in their toolbox. This is another opportunity to go out to your institutes of higher education and say, we're preparing our kids to be leaders of the future, and an opportunity to connect with experts in the community to help them help you make this make sense for students. And so I really just wanted to, sometimes I think we get stuck in like the weedy details of how am I going to actually execute this, but I wanted to pull back and share sort of the grander vision for why we do Design Challenge anyway, because Design Challenge has all of the ingredients that are important for high quality STEM experiences for students. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to hear your discussion and help with any questions you may have.
Thanks, Heather. Really appreciate that. All right. We're going to jump in then to the specifics of how to implement and design a successful Design Challenge, and thinking about some of those things that Heather mentioned. I know Carol next session is going to be talking about how do we connect this both to real world connections, standards, and community, but also just thinking about how do we design this to create a culture of innovation within our students as well. So I keep going back to this definition of project-based learning or a design challenge as an ill-defined problem with a well-defined outcome. And the reason it's an ill-defined problem is because you want the students to actually identify the problem first. So you want to give them a topic area to focus on for their problem identification. And once they define their problem, then it becomes a well-defined problem. But as the teacher and this is so hard for teachers to get used to, but you want to provide a lot of flexibility and maneuverability for the students. So you want to leave it pretty open-ended as far as the problem that you give to students, because you want a lot of movement and a lot of different, you want students to be able to engage in things that they're really interested in. However, along with that well-defined or ill-defined problem, you want to give them right from the beginning a well-defined outcome. They should have a rubric that they know what the end product should look like, or what pieces it needs to have in order to be a successful design challenge prototype. And they should know that from day one. This isn't something that you should give them sort of towards the end after they've identified the problem. They should know what they're aiming toward, or what at least they need to include in their showcase right from the beginning. So that whole idea of the ill-defined problem, well-defined outcome is something that's hard for teachers to get used to, but something that's really important and really inherent in the project-based learning side of the design challenge. Along with that, though, consistent check-ins and benchmarks are really important, because it can be such a free-floating, or we talked about the design challenge steps being an iterative process, in that sometimes the students are going back and working on an earlier stage of the design cycle. You might have some students who are working on the Ideate stage, while some students are still defining their problem. And so you want to make clear check-ins and benchmarks along the way, so that students know what to do when they get there and what to do next. So that constantly, like, meeting with students, engaging with them, and seeing where they're at, making sure they're on the right track is really, really helpful. Then on the teaching side of things, and this is something that administrators or program coordinators really can help with, is this co-planning time. Planning time for either teachers within departments, or cross silos, cross-departmentally, time for like participants to and teachers to know where and when their section of the design challenge is going to take place. So I've attached this Gantt chart. Is anybody familiar with Gantt charts? I just sort of like whipped one up very quickly so you could see what this might look like for teachers to utilize in order for co-planning and in order to sort of like know what other departments are doing in the design challenge process. So for example, you might have this sort of like color-coded, like, here's the empathy stage, here's the define stage, here's the ideate stage. The empathy stage maybe is going to take place in the social studies department. The define stage might take place in the English department. And then it's broken down here by how long, or at least an estimate of how long those stages might take. And then this way you can give this over to teachers, and they can plan around the expectations for when they should be utilizing or adopting some of these some of the design challenge elements into their curriculum. Now, this one is useful if it's a cross-curricular design challenge, but even if it's within a single department, let's say the science department is doing a design challenge, it's really helpful to plan and coordinate across grade levels to see when these different stages of the design cycle will take place, and how to plan with the end in sight and with the end in mind. And so if you're planning around like the OSLN showcase or something like that, maybe having that as that final showcase. But this is just a simple one for what might be like a 6-week fall, 6 to 8 week fall design challenge. Next, the pedagogical element of a hands-off approach. This as well is a little bit difficult for teachers to get to wrap their minds around. And what it doesn't mean is that the teacher just gives the materials over to the students, tells them what they need to do, and then lets them do their thing. But rather, those constant check-ins and benchmarks are really important, but there's not the teacher, what the teacher believes is the solution to a problem, or the solution that the teacher has in mind isn't what is driving the students, but rather they are developing their own problems and they are developing their own solutions. And that sometimes can lead to teachers just needing to let students work it out themselves and see what they come up with. And again, this doesn't mean that you're not providing insight for the students, or you're not providing direction for the students, but it does mean that there's less of a direct, like, here is exactly like a scripted outcome that needs to take place from the design challenge. And then Carol, do you want to go over connecting to standards and community?
I do. Yes, thank you. So these are, again, the two topics that we'll be focusing on in our next session, which is 2 weeks from today. And as Noah goes through the design challenge with you, I want you to, as I mentioned earlier, think about the standards. So this is one of the challenges that that teachers find, is looking at a design challenge not as something else, but something new. So rather than feeling as though they need to teach their standards and then implement a design challenge, we want to shift that thought pattern to be the design challenge being the teaching modality of the standard. So thinking about that, and then looking at some of the ways we can create those connections. So do we start with the standards and write the design challenge, or do we start with the design challenge and identify the standards? So that'll be a question we talk about next time. But as I said today, just sort of think about, what are the standards for the course you teach if you're a teacher, or if you're supporting teachers, what are some of the standards that they'll be teaching? And maybe you think about the ones that would be most challenging. So that's sort of an introductory to next time. And then number 6, connecting to the community. And of course, that can include, as Heather mentioned earlier, higher education. We are, literally on the campus of Ohio State University. So our connection to Ohio State is pretty strong. Do you have those sort of connections where you are? Do you have community leaders, perhaps parents or friends in the community whose work is supported by the learning that happens in these design challenges? So identifying those early and leveraging those resources early is really important. And that's going to be our main focus for next time.
Great. So I just want to take a moment to check in with you all. Which one of these pedagogies do you think is going to be maybe the biggest challenge for your particular context? Or what additional strategies have you used for those of you who have done design challenges before that you find really helpful, or that you think the rest of us could learn from? You can feel free to unmute or utilize the chat if you're more comfortable with that. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I'd love to see them in the chat also, so that I have some information to provide for you for next time. Time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Brian, and that's why, and it's even harder with that co-planning time. Like even planning time in general is hard to come by for teachers, but actual co-planning time for them all to meet together to talk about how to implement these is really a challenge. Yeah.
And I would just add to that, there are important planning time cohorts to include departmental and then also cross-curricular. So it is a big challenge.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, that hands-off approach, it can be really challenging. Yeah. A guide on the side is another way to phrase it. Yeah, thanks, Heather. And have you found any ways that has been like most helpful, or have you found strategies to help teachers with that?
Say just by them experiencing it, that's the best way. So one teacher last year that I was coaching and helping along the way admitted that was going to be her biggest challenge.
Right.
After the students we sort of had a Shark Tank culmination showcase. And after the teams presented their ideas and responded to questions from our panel and yada, 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 she and I had a moment, and she was so tearful and emotional about the experience. And now she's like my biggest spokesperson, because she admitted that was going to be her biggest challenge to overcome, and seeing it all come to fruition and the culminating event, so experiencing it, I think, is the best way to overcome it, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a good good point and a good observation. And I think teachers just often forget that we're learners too. Like we're right in this with the students as well, learning through this process as well. So sometimes those lessons can be are hard to learn. Yeah,
I think it's important to remember that implementing design challenge in and of itself is a design challenge. So, we'll give this a shot, and then we'll step back and observe and make corrections. And, it's just a learning process that we implement as teachers and the student implement through the design challenge.
Sure. Yeah. Tori, so you said you're limited by time constraints. By the entire process, do you mean that you implement the entire design challenge in 1 to 2 days? Oh, okay. Okay. So you've got a very limited time with the students. Okay. This design challenge that we go over next could probably be consolidated to 1 to 2 days. So so hopefully this will still be helpful for you in some way. All right. So I'm going to go over the design challenge. And this is one that was utilized, I created for our summer bridge program, which is to help incoming freshmen sort of adopt to the changes of Metro High School. And one of the major distinctions of Metro is design challenge. So this was a week long. We had the students from 8 to noon for a week long period, and design challenge ended up being between an hour and a half each day. So this is about a 5 to 7 hour design challenge. But again, it could be either added to if you wanted to make it a little bit longer, or parts could be removed if you wanted to consolidate it and make it a little bit shorter. And so what I'm going to do is just sort of like walk you through what I do with the students. It's about 70 slides total, so I'm not going to go over each slide in great detail, but it's broken down by day, and then we'll just have a discussion about it at the end, and some things that you noticed, observed, and how you might be able to utilize something like this in your school. At any point, though, throughout the process, please feel free to interrupt and jump in with questions, comments. Always helpful. So, all right. So the title of this design challenge was Making Space for Change. And I first introduced what a design challenge was. I did this in about 30 minutes. So about 30 minutes for this, what is a design challenge? We started with the turn and talk just to sort of like get them thinking about a problem and how to fix a problem. Then I went over the design challenge process. This one utilized those 2 additional steps, notice and reflect. But again, whatever your design challenge cycle is, feel free to replace that with this. And I've made that in comments on these slides as well, just so you know like where to edit things or give suggestions for where to edit things. And then I talk about like just what a design challenge is. And we did a very, very mini design challenge right there. This was like a 20 to 25 minute design challenge, just so they could think about how this process works. So this was waking up in the morning is difficult. What product could you develop to make your morning routine easier? So for each of the next slides, I just had them turn and talk to their neighbor and then share with their tribe. The tribe was like the theme of the Summer Bridge program was survivor. So each of the design challenge process, part of the cycle, there was questions that I had them like turn and talk to each other about. So we walked through notice, empathize, define, ideate, prototype. And then for testing, I just had them like, how could you test your solution to know if it worked? And then how would you know if your solution worked? That's really important for students to know as they're building their prototype and testing, just to be prototyping with testing in mind. How will you know if the solution actually works? And then the reflection process is, what are the big takeaways? What did you learn? What are the next steps in your for your prototype? So then I introduced the larger design challenge question, which was, I think it's on here. So here at, and then I removed Metro just so that you could insert your own school. We love every inch of our space. However, there's always room for improvement. So over the next few days, we're going to be on the lookout for how we can make our space even better. So the design challenge question was, how can you reimagine and redesign an aspect of our school environment to make space for change? So you can see the parallels over this year's OSLN design challenge, but this year's OSLN design challenge includes infrastructure, it includes schools, it includes a much broader range of topics and focus areas. But for this 1 week design challenge, I just wanted to focus on the school environment and space. So I just took one piece of the design challenge of the OSLN design challenge and made it smaller and more digestible for the students that we had and the timeline that we have.
And if I could jump in just a moment, I think that's a really important thing to remember. On our first meeting, many of you said you're looking not at a school-wide design challenge at this point, but looking more at design challenges that live within classrooms. So that's a great thought, is to say, you know, what kind of infrastructure in our classroom could we be looking at, or keeping it to a smaller environment, or how do my standards come into this solution?
Yeah. And then typically with a longer design challenge, like a 6 to 8 week, they might get a whole like a portfolio or a single sheet of like the constraints and limitations of the design challenge. I just wanted to give it to them very quickly and briefly though. So the requirements were that the prototype must have a physical component, must be testable. Your solution must focus on making a school a better place for everyone, not just certain individuals. And then they also had a solution restraint of $5,000. So that was what it would cost for their prototype to be fully implemented in the school. And the reason I put that limitation on there is because I actually wanted to present these to administration as like potential solutions for problems that students identified. And a lot of those the ideas that they had actually ended up being implemented by the teachers and admin later on, which was really, really cool for the students to see that their ideas were taken seriously as well. So again, this is day one. So day one starts with the notice and empathize. I introduced the design challenge question, constraints of the design challenge, and then we jump right in with this notice and empathize. So the first thing that they did was they toured the school, and they were touring the school with the design challenge question in mind. So as they walk through the school, observe spaces that don't seem to be used effectively or completely unused. Remember to think about the design challenge essential question. I gave them things to look for. Again, you want to give them ideas, but you don't want to give them like, you don't want to lead them too much to a solution that you have in mind. You want them to identify what problem they found. And it was really interesting to see some of the problems that the students identified, problems that I had never really observed at all. So, so then they took a tour. And then when they came back, it was what was one space that you thought was used well? What was one space that was not used well? So again, looking at like positive aspects, not just focusing on problems, and maybe using solutions from areas that were used well for areas that were underutilized or not used well. We did a little like empathy map to put ourselves in the shoes of people who were affected by the problem that they identified. And then we transitioned to answering those questions about who is most affected and how does that problem affect them. And then they did this activity here where they listed some of the potential problems that they noticed and who is most affected by each of the problems that they identified, and then pick one of the problems and really focus on that. And I wanted them to actually like sort of get tangible with their problem. So I wanted them to draw it in more with more details. And again, you want to really reiterate to those students, you're just focusing on the problem first, not the solution. Like we don't need to think about how to fix this yet. We can just think about like, why is this a problem? And then we pulled back together and talked about that empathy stage. And then we just ended with some planning for the coming week. So over the next week, they're going to be developing a solution, creating a real prototype, and being creative. At the end, they filled out a Google form, and this Google form is utilized by teachers to form groups. So we found it pretty successful to form groups of like 3 to 4. You get a wide variety of student input, but you also don't like stall out, or the group doesn't get too big and too many opinions. But again, it's totally up to your school context. But this form is really important because we want students to form groups based on common interests and common problems that they've identified, not based on just who their friends are in the classroom. So the form focuses on like, what are problem areas that you identified? And then the teachers would then use that information to form groups. And that's day one, okay? Any questions, comments about day one? Anything? I know I'm going fast, but I also don't want to take up all of your time just going through the process. So open to feedback, comments, concerns. All right, let's jump right in with define then. So day 2 is define. And I always I wanted to start every day with going over the design cycle. It's whatever design cycle you use, it's important for students to see that in lots of different classrooms, in outside of classrooms. They just need to sort of be familiar with this sort of language so that they can think about problems outside of the school in the same sort of design cycle process. And again, same thing, design challenge question starts every lesson. I had them swap SWOT problems. Their groups were formed based on that teacher data. And then we started talking about shareholders. So shareholders, stakeholders. I had them do the activity that I believe I shared this last week, where it's like analyzing the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders? What role does the stakeholder play in the process? Why do they want the problem to be solved? And what does solve look like for each stakeholder? And then I give some examples here of what some stakeholders might be for some of their problems. So thinking about it in terms of school, from the student's perspective, from the teacher's perspective, from the admin perspective, from the parent's perspective, all of these people might have stake in the problem that students identified. Then once they've identified their problem, so they're sort of like focusing in their problem, they've identified their stakeholders that are related to the problem, then they develop a needs statement. So again, I think this was shared last week as well, but there's a couple of examples up here for students to use, and then they develop their individual need statement, and then with their group, they develop a need statement as well. And this will give them direction. They can sort of like go back to this as their anchor point throughout the design challenge process. And then the next day is Ideate. So we're already 2 days in, and then this third stage is the Ideate or ideation stage. So you can also see sort of these patterns that I incorporate into the design challenge process, as well as like they're constantly like talking about their ideas with each other to get new ideas and to be able to share their ideas so that they make sense as well. So this is the big like brainstorming day, and at this point they're working in groups. So day one they were doing it sort of individually, and then starting from day two they're going to constantly be meeting in their groups throughout this process as well. Some of the things they're doing individually within their groups though, and then meeting together as a group to share. So I divided the brainstorm into 3 stages. Stage 1 is start broad. No idea is too big, too crazy. Don't think about the limitations or constraints at this point. Just like get as many ideas out there on paper as possible. Stage 2 is to categorize your ideas. So how do we organize these ideas and think about them in different ways? And then finally, after they've got a bunch of ideas, they're narrowing down for potential solutions. So I have them start by creating an individual list. I find that if students start generating a list immediately together, then they're limited by other people's opinions. Where if they start individually, each individual student creates a list. When they come together, there's a broader range of ideas represented. And then this activity, it's a little, I don't know, it's maybe right on the edge of middle school, high school, but it's called the 6 hats, and it's thinking about their ideas in with different hats on. So for example, the yellow hat symbolizes optimism, confidence, and brightness. Under this hat, you explore the positives and probe for value and benefits of your solution. So the questions to think about: what solutions provide the biggest benefits? So after they've generated a long list, then they sort of start to categorize these ideas based on the 6 hats method. I won't go through each of the hats, but I sort of have a slide here that they would walk through. The teacher would walk them through each of these hats, and they would categorize their ideas there. And then after they've done that, that's when they begin to categorize their ideas. And then let me just pull up the sheet that I have them work on as they're doing this. And it's listed in like the personal list, then the team list. So they start big with the personal list and then team list. And then this is where stage 2 comes in, and they begin to categorize their categorize their ideas. So after they've viewed it in terms of like hats individually, they come together and categorize based on these 4 major categories. So the rational choice, the most likely to impress, the darling or loved one, and then the long shot. And you'll see like a lot of these are resources that I shared last week. And these are resources that we use regardless of what the design challenge question are. So it's nice that you can have those resources available regardless of what next year's OSLN design challenge question is, regardless of whether you want to implement your own or create your own design challenge. Those resources are pretty usable in multiple in all sorts of design challenge questions. So then they start to question their solutions. Again, going back to that need statement, does this actually go back to what we identified? So once they have a large list, then they can start narrowing down to smaller ideas. And that's what the final stage is. So it's time to narrow down the idea to their potential solution, and that is on still that same sort of graphic organizer. So then they have a conversation like, our team will focus on the problem of blank. We believe the root cause of the problem is blank. Therefore, we believe the best solution to test will be, and this is where they finally transition from identifying the problem to actually thinking about how they could fix that problem specifically with the solution that they have identified. So then their homework, again, this is very dependent on how long this design challenge takes, but they need to start like gathering their own materials in order to make a testable prototype. So we usually put the onus on the students to bring in what they need in order to make their prototype. Your school might provide things for the students, and we always have some things, but we really put the onus on the students, and they really step up when they're invested in this process. So then day 4 is prototyping, and from the teacher's perspective, it's a pretty straightforward, simple day. You're just having the students do whatever they need in order to create their prototype. However, they also need to create like a pitch for their prototype. And this is usually when I just remind students that they need to plan their prototype with the end in mind of that like presentation pitch element. So just remind students that all of the groups need to participate, a brief description of how their prototype works, and an explanation of the benefits of their prototype. And then it's presentation time. So the bulk of this day is really spent on that developing the prototype. And students get really excited for this day or this time. So it's fun to see them develop those. And then finally, test and reflect. And this one is really important to help students with, because they often they think they've developed like the perfect solution, and they don't want to go back and change it. It's really hard to convince students to receive feedback and then actually go back in and fix the problems that have been identified. So really reiterate that feedback is just a key part of the design cycle, and that it's really important to incorporate that feedback in there. So we have a discussion about what good feedback is. And then for this particular design challenge, we used this feedback matrix. So we put big posters, like giant sticky posters next to each prototype, and then divided them up into this T-chart with a plus, delta, question, and lightning bulb. And then we had students move around the room and add feedback to each other's prototypes. This can look a number of different ways. Oftentimes it's really helpful if the students can be right there sort of explaining how their prototype works. So it depends on who you get in to judge their work, but we just had sort of the students moving around and viewing each other's work, and they asked like really good questions, and it was interesting to see some of the overlap of proposed solutions as well. And then that's it. So yeah. So we're just going to go ahead and pause there. I know that was a lot of information. So I want to give us, and we have about 30 minutes to just sort of like reflect on some of these steps of the design cycle and the design challenge process, and maybe think about it in terms of 3 questions. So what aspects of the design challenge would fit within the needs of your school? What changes would you need to make to utilize this design challenge? And then I know that question of barriers is really important. So what barriers exist in implementing this design challenge within your school? Oh, Brian, thanks. Yeah. And would you all prefer to meet in a breakout room? Would this be helpful for you to sort of meet with each other, or do we want to have this as a whole group discussion? I'm open to either. So whatever you think would be the most helpful. Yeah, so some of them are very unique to Metro, but I can absolutely share some of them. So Metro has no lockers. So some of the students developed like a locker system, and then where they could put that. So they came up with really creative ways of where they could put lockers, because we also have pretty limited space at Metro. So we have these like wheelie benches that sit around our lunch tables. And so they talked about installing like lockers underneath those, which I thought was a really interesting and innovative solution. There's also lots of prototypes around flexible seating options. So they wanted what are those? The balls that you sit on,
Balls.
yeah, and like there are certain chairs with those like built into them as well, standing desks. So some of the one group I remember very distinctly came up with this like full model of what a classroom could look like with different varying seating options for students. A couple of students noticed the inconsistency in numbering for our classrooms. Like room 187 might be over here, but then 193 is like, so our numbering system was really confusing. That was something that I like never even thought about. I was just like, well, my room's 110 and that's all I need to know. But for students who are transitioning to classes, it's really confusing. So they printed off like a blueprint of the school and like rewrote the numbering system for that. So yeah, those are some of them that are coming up to mind now. But yeah, thanks for asking, Tori.
When I taught geometry, one of the things we looked at was the traffic flow on pickup times, and so that was sort of in the same context of a system in the school that was challenging, and so bringing in the geometry standards of design was really interesting. It was interesting to see what the kids came up with. And we did make some changes based on that.
That's great.
It's also interesting to see that they really do come up with practical solutions.
They do.
Every year we have opportunity to participate from the student presentations. And I'm always like completely gobsmacked about how smart these kids are and the level of ownership that the students take in presenting their solutions to an authentic audience, and the amount of buy-in that creates for the students and pride that they have to be able to present their ideas to grown-ups.
Agreed. And I think another thing to remember is, or to remind the students is that they will have an authentic audience, a stakeholder who's interested in the solutions I have, and their solutions could be implemented.
Maybe we could start with that first question. So what aspects of this design challenge do you think would fit within the needs of your school? I know that some of you are in different situations. Tori, I know that you mentioned that you only get students for about a week. So what aspects of this design challenge might fit with your school's needs?
And that can be whole school, or it can be within the needs of your classroom.
Sorry, if I may ask, do you mean the one that you shared specifically, or the OSLN one, or just the process itself?
And thanks for asking that question. I had the same thought. I didn't know if he was referring to the process or that challenge specifically, or the network challenge.
I was asking that same question, but on mute. We're all in agreement. We need some clarification.
Okay, I'm sorry. That must mean it was a poorly worded question. I meant this specific design challenge. So the one that we just went over. So not the OSLN design challenge, but this sort of like smaller piece that we removed to look at for a week.
Got it. Well, I actually did something very similar, so it was cool to see how you did it. Last year, two similar ones in onboarding some teachers to attempt to do this. One, and they both came up organically, which was beautiful because that's really how it should be. So one was, I'm in a pre-K to 8 building, and the 6th through 8th graders have their own entryway. So the president of the school had kind of brought up at a faculty meeting to the teachers that they were thinking of maybe redoing that entryway for the prep students. And I'm like, there you go. That's a perfect STEM PBL challenge or whatever.
Right.
So it was onboarding the teachers, and that was the one teacher I was talking about that got a little emotional. So we looked at, and I like going to look at what they are doing in their literature classes, because a lot of times you could do it beautifully with literature in a book, and they were reading The Outsiders. So it was such a perfect fit because it was looking at how they can redesign that entryway. So we kicked it off with a Socratic seminar, which was cool, discussing what it means to be an outsider. But it was very similar to your challenge. And then when we formed the teams, I posed the idea of forming the teams how you would organically in the professional world. We had someone whose gifts and talents might be art, and someone whose gifts and talents might be math, and build these professional teams, if you will, with these different roles. So we tapped in the career readiness in that way. And then the other one that was similar was the 8th grade didn't want to cancel their dance. So even though they were back on site, that's the big tradition. They have this end of the year dance. So that I said, perfect PBL, you guys, this is perfect. How can they reimagine their 8th grade dance in a COVID friendly way? Or I don't have the exact wording that we ended up coming up with. And again, it was phenomenal. And then they had to all pitch their reimagined 8th grade dances. So yours brought me back to last year. I know that wasn't long ago, but it can fit. It can fit, and you can onboard anybody. We've onboarded science and looked at the science of color for the hallway, and just you could bring in the others once you kind of get that focus of what the authentic problem is. I think it's great. The barrier, I think I already mentioned, teachers hating to give up that control, like I want to take over. I want to jump in, and letting the kids lead and us lead from behind, if you will. So yeah. I hope that wasn't too wordy and lengthy, but it just got me excited because it reminded me of ours.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing, Ann.
I love those. I can really see the buy-in from students.
Yeah.
No, I'll jump on that.
Yeah.
One of the aspects of this design challenge I see is that it's universally applicable. It doesn't matter if you're doing pre-K through 3, or if you got middle school kids, or you got high school kids. So it's not bound by a grade level or a content area. It's open enough that anybody can jump in as you identify the category that they're going to be focusing on. It allows space for students to have the ability to predetermine what they identify as their own problems, within that challenge. So the challenge is more categorical as it is as an umbrella that it sits. So it allows the students to say, these are the areas that we have interest in. And it also kind of funnels them into having this idea of taking ownership over their school and having pride in their school and their community, which is such a huge thing when you're building culture at a school, regardless of grade level, is to have that student ownership piece connected to it. So anything that you can do connected to making improvements at the school level is always a great way to get student buy-in. When the students are bought in, they're more engaged. When they're more engaged, the teachers are more excited. So it's kind of a win-win all the way up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing, Brian. And that was one thing when I ran this by our administrator. She wanted me to make sure that I spun it in a way that was like, we like our school, but what are some things that we can make different? Because it can very easily slip into like, this like how can we just like completely, start from scratch and do things over. So I did, I think I started the design challenge with that, like we love every inch of our space, but there's still room for improvement. So.
Yeah, that's always the fear, that once you open up the conversations to what challenges, what problems exist, that people are going to go down the rabbit hole of the negativity connected to those and the emotions connected to those. And it's not like this at the other school. It's not like this at the other campus. And so framing it in a positive way, but framing it as an opportunity for improvement is so key to create that buy-in.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point, Brian, that how it's framed is really important. So great. Sorry, I lost the questions. There we go. So thinking about your specific institutional context, what changes might you need to make in order to utilize this sort of design challenge? So Tori, I know that you said you're trying to consolidate it in 1 to 2 days. I'm not sure of other contexts for Anne, Glenn, Emily, or Brian, but what are some things that you might need to change about this design challenge? Also thinking about like different grade levels too. Like this is directed towards that transition between middle school and high school. So some of you might be teaching younger, some of you might be a little bit more older. So how might you need to change some of those things to utilize this?
No, if you don't mind, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I would change if we were going to do something for some of the schools here in Arizona, it's kind of building off of some of the slides that Heather shared when she was talking about, looking at the culture, the curriculum, and the connections to why you're doing an activity. So really making it a little bit more overt between what the students would be doing once they've identified that problem to where are there opportunities to follow up with that passion. So if a student takes on a challenge like this of redesigning a space in the classroom, once that's been defined, really making a connection between what they're doing and the types of problems that they're solving, and what are the opportunities to continue that if you got really excited about it. So what are the careers that are out there? What's the pathway that you would have to follow to be able to study, to be able to do that? So creating that identity in those students, that STEM identity piece is such an amazing opportunity there.
Yeah,
so
that's a great observation, Brian. Yeah.
That is a great one. And I think that's where the connection to community can come in when we bring in, leaders and professionals within the community who are the stakeholders in these kind of solutions, that it can really create richness in the solution and the problem and engagement in the students.
Can I make an and statement? I agree with everything that Brian just said. And I think if there are opportunities for the kids to follow through with one next step, right? So we had kids in Pickerington a couple of years ago during our food insecurity design challenge propose that there was a space in the school that should be repurposed to be turned into a kitchen classroom. And so to teach kids about nutrition. So these kids came up with this super great plan to make this kitchen in their school. They actually went as far as pitching that at a school board meeting and getting the school board to say, yes, we agree with this. And they rallied behind those students to make that actually happen. So even if you don't go as far as sending the students to the board meeting, helping them at least ideate, work the design cycle again around what's one thing you can do now to make your prototype come to fruition, to make your idea or your solution happen in reality. Whether that's identifying careers and someone who'd have to be on your team to be able to implement your solution, or writing a letter or asking permission, or whatever you might need to do to be able to advocate that your solution is implemented, I think can be super instructive and a great way to make this an even richer experience, particularly for our older learners.
Yeah, and that's such an easy way to make it interdisciplinary. When you started adding in those ELA components, those speaking and listening pieces, those writing components.
Right. And that's actually the direction we're moving at Metro is embedding the design challenge into those subject areas. And so thinking about what subject areas align strongest with different aspects of the design cycle. So yeah, I think that's a great observation, Brian.
Right, and that connection to the standards.
Mm-hmm. Brian, what are some ways that you have seen in your in design challenges that you've run or organized that you have seen that follow through done most effectively, especially thinking about that like career component? So
that's going to be a difficult one to answer, just because we run our design challenges so differently.
Okay.
Here in Arizona, and each one is, yeah. I would love to have a follow-up conversation with you, but I don't think I can give you a quick, clean answer for that one.
Okay.
Noah, Carol, Glenn Bailey put some great comments in the chat. I wanted to just make sure you saw those.
Okay, great. Yeah,
Did not. Okay, Glenn, that sounds like maybe some barriers you're anticipating more, or needs, I guess would be a better way to say that, more prep time and involvement from teachers. So both.
Yeah, and Glenn, is that something that you feel as if needs to come from your school's administration, like that dedicated planning time?
I can talk. Sorry, I have a very poor connection, so I have to type more. No, it's honestly, it's mostly my constraint. It's just the way that I'm contracted with the school for this school year. So I'm only a part-time, basically an hourly lecturer when I come in. And I'm aware there's a couple other things I'm more looking at barriers, but I just have to be more purposeful working with the teachers. And so it is a lot more check-in times. I think just really communication. So when I'm adapting some of these things, it may only be a 3-hour design challenge, but I can do it over, 3 to 5 weeks, and work with certain groups. And so that's kind of the other thing. It may not be an equity and access piece when we're designing. So we're really looking at subsets of students or by grade level. Or possibly depending on certain, they take a class, which is essentially like a very structured study hall. They have the time and then they have supports, academic supports during that. And so often it might be cool out, so I'll have kids come down. But I mean, the benefit that we have is because of the culture of the school, and it really is built around project-based learning and longer form stuff. The only students that we really, I think, have to worry about a little bit more, we just expanded this year to include 8th grade. And so they don't really have the skills. And so we were looking at design challenges, really breaking down some of those skills or even the stages within a design challenge. And so I could do, 9 different weeks where I'm only focusing on that one. And if I could do it isolated on a skill, certain topic or something, or inadvertently build it up so that it ends up becoming one whole design challenge that they've completed. So yeah, so just have to be a little, it just takes a lot more planning, but I have some flexibility to be able to do that because of the position I'm in, to take some of that off of the teachers.
Okay.
Okay.
Glenn, where do you teach and what do you do?
That's a good question. So 3 days a week, I work for a nonprofit doing economic development and youth workforce development programming. It's called Geauga Growth Partnership. It's in Geauga County.
Yeah, I guessed you were at iSTEM because you said 8th grade.
Yeah, and then iSTEM so 3 days a week in a nonprofit, 2 days a week teaching at iSTEM. And so I brought in this year. So they've had a fab lab that's been shuttered if we're talking about barriers. And it's kind of both for me for the last year and a half. So they moved campuses. They were with Auburn Career Center, which is our vocational tech. And based on Auburn's expansion, iSTEM ended up moving out of that building and getting their own building. And it's great that they've purchased it, but it's an old building. And so, there are a lot of things. I literally have like probably a many $1,000 bill staring at me on just trying to rehab equipment and, not having supplies. And so there's other things, but it's good. The kids have to really think more with less. So in some instances, it's actually been really beneficial. But yeah, it's been good. I love this school and there's a lot of opportunity.
I think another way potentially to solve your particular issue, if we can spend a minute on that, is figuring out how might you be sort of like the design challenge behind the scenes producer for teachers. So, and I think that that's like something that's worth talking about. We've seen a number of schools, and I know that this is a luxury, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's been a successful model for schools that can figure it out. We've had a number of schools who've been in charge of, or who've created a position for someone who's in charge of being like the design challenge producer. So in other words, they find the materials, they identify the partners, they create the schedule, they create all the structures and scaffolds and supports that teachers need in order to implement. The teachers then are the folks who are responsible for rolling out the challenge, coming up with the, day-to-day activities, but you have someone who's like your right arm who can be like, we need pipe cleaners, great, I'll get you those. You need a speaker about material science, super, I've got you. So perhaps there might be an opportunity to work with your administration and the staff to figure out how the teachers could be responsible for the leading, but you could come in as a co-producer.
Exactly. It really, that's exactly kind of the way we've seen it. We understand. And even now, as far as we are into the school year and where we're looking at the spring, it's more of an instructional specialist. I'm really able to pull that and develop some curriculum, have the pieces in place, look for what we have. And that's how I honestly see the position probably scaling as well into the future, because it is still rotations of students and I may not see every student. That'll be the future plan will be, it might be rotations, like every 2 months I'm seeing certain grades so that by the end of the year, we are seeing it. Our other big question, and really what I've posed to administration and the rest of the faculty, is how do we really look at the scaffolding of these design challenges? Like, how do we build up to our seniors who essentially are taking on a capstone project and using design thinking as part of that process? And so, all the way to these 8th graders who really have no introduction to this, and this is a fresh start for them. That's kind of where my research, I guess, has been from this year, where I've been collecting information. So
can we talk about that for just a second and go back to this whole culture piece? So one of the things, what changes might you need to make to this design challenge that I thought of immediately, knowing a bunch of different schools? One of the changes might be to use a different design cycle that resonates more clearly or closely with your school culture or your learners. So we see a lot of schools who've adopted a particular design cycle that might not be the Stanford model that you illustrated so beautifully on your slides, Noah. That's okay. It doesn't matter, right? And sometimes if you don't have a school-wide adopted design challenge, like you might even pick like a shorter design cycle, right? Ask, imagine, prototype, test, improve, create, whatever, plan, test, create, improve, whatever you want to do, depending upon your school context and your learners, you might switch that up. Another thing is when you're bringing on 8th graders who've maybe never done design thinking before, you know, using that as a scaffold, like we're going to investigate design thinking and we're going to do a short challenge this time, and then we'll do a longer, more robust challenge next time. But to help them begin to become familiar with the vocabulary and just the concept of design thinking as a first step, and then grow from there, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yes.
Yeah, I shared some different design cycles that have been shared with me. I shared Trudy's from like a more kindergarten perspective as well, and then building on your second point as well, Heather. I have my planning period right outside of the art teacher's room, and it's great for me to hear the design cycle that we use at Metro being taught in her art class too. She's walking through the design cycle with students creating pieces of art, and so it's really neat. And I know that not all the teachers are in a position like this, but when it is whole school, or there can be a culture where design-based thinking is part of that school environment. You see it pop up in all of these really interesting and cool ways.
And I think that's a really good point, Noah, as well, for teacher buy-in, is when you can identify those teachers that are all in and are giving it a shot in their classroom, sharing that, and maybe doing instructional rounds so other teachers can observe, like you get to do during your planning period. I think that's a very strong, a strong reason for teachers to implement design challenge. And I wanted to ask a follow-up question, Glenn, to you. Are you supporting teachers within their classrooms to create mini design challenges, or is your role mostly for a full school coordination of a design challenge?
I will say the intention is for both, to be honest.
Okay.
And so, I mean, right now it's really been, even on a smaller scale, I mean, it's been a one-to-one student helping mostly our seniors, because they're the ones that are directly responsible right now for going to that first stage of their project and for the year. And so that's where it's been at. And because I'm still pretty limited on what I have available to them, you know, there's a heck of a lot of ideation that is happening and kind of coaching through some of the steps and getting in. So it's been good. But yeah, but definitely the intention is to get to that once we build up and really have that library and have that strategic direction. I think that'll be helpful. So one-to-one, kind of the small group, probably push in, and then, you know, whole school coordination.
Okay. Yeah.
And just to throw it in there, so Noah, I really appreciated you sharing that, because my background is actually in art and design. I was a certified technology applications and art teacher. So that's kind of where my love for all of this started.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, that's cool to see that you can integrate your art into your STEM career as well. Heather, I'm sort of in the same boat as you. I'm in English, but still, like I love integrating this design-based thinking right in there as well.
Well, and I should add, I'm a math teacher. And so it was after a couple years of implementing design challenges that we realized that the math that was happening in the design challenge was a chart or a graph. And that's kind of where it terminated. So, you know, we realized the importance to connect to content standard, the importance of connecting to the content standards for each level of student. was so important and difficult for teachers as well. You know, how to take those Ohio content standards or wherever you are content standards and see them in action in the design challenge and create mini challenges within the classroom that scaffold toward a bigger design challenge was challenging. So that again is something we'll talk about next week.
Yeah, here's a question for you all. Do you find, do you think that it would be helpful to give sort of like this pre-scripted design challenge, or like Carol was just talking about, like very specifically like pull their standards and give them a direct one-to-one correlation? Like here are your standards, here's how this design challenge relates, like, you know, within the rubric, and sort of like give teachers that that guidance. Would that help them along the process? Or do you think that would be too overbearing for the teachers that you interact with?
That's a great question.
I'm not sure I understand your question. Was it specifically to Glenn?
No, this is to anyone who is working alongside teachers. So anyone who is sort of like helping teachers to implement design challenges. Yeah.
No, it's a great question, and it's an impossible question.
Okay.
Because it's almost impossible to design a support that's going to meet every teacher at every place they're at in the curriculum,
Sure.
regardless of grade level, content area, and time of year. And so it's nearly impossible. And it's also, I mean, it's much like a FOSS kit. If you give them too much, then you don't create buy-in. You don't change the teachers' mindsets
Right.
on how to do it. They're just going through, you know, a prescriptive way of teaching a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really change themselves. And much like you want the ill-defined problem for students, sometimes an ill-defined problem for teachers is equally, if not more, valuable. It's just a matter of communicating the why and maybe demonstrating the how in some specific way. So showing them how you aligned all of your standards in your example would be really good. Showing how you justified that time within your own content and your own sequencing, I think is great. But yeah, impossible.
Challenging,
That was
certainly.
good.
Challenging, you're right. I shouldn't say impossible. I apologize. Carol Dweck would be so mad at me.
And I would say, you know, to all of you, as you prepare for our next session, if you can sort of think about the design challenge that Noah shared with us, and do you see standards for the teachers you're supporting, or if you're a teacher for the content standards that you teach, do you see standards in this design challenge? Do you see where your content is part of the solution, could be part of the solution or the justification of the solution? Or the communication of the solution, depending on what you're supporting, what you're teaching.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and I don't want to bring it to a close if people still have things that they want to add to the conversation, but I still did want to build in enough time within our time frame, just going back to those norms. We want to start on time and we want to end on time. So if you could take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback form, that would be really helpful for us. Carol and I look at those after each session, and we really do try to incorporate that feedback into our next sessions. So the more specific and the more the more specific you can be, the better. That'd be great. And we can handle some rough critiques. So you can
Please,
give
yes.
it to us straight.
I also included my email address in the chat box. So as you think about the next session, connection to standards, particularly, if there are any needs that you have or any topics you would like to discuss, please feel free to email me between now and then so that we can make sure that our last session meets your needs.
And one final note about that last session, it is November 9th. So we're skipping next week just because of voting day. And then we'll meet again in 2
Yes.
weeks.